December 2020. "He's still not answering the phone," I exclaimed, the frustration evident in my voice as I slammed the handset back onto its cradle. It was the third time that morning my father had failed to pick up. "This isn't like him." "Have you tried his mobile?" suggested Thomas Scott, my colleague and friend from the other side of our large open-plan office. We'd known each other for nearly 30 years, our friendship forged in the aisles of the supermarket where we worked in our early 20s. It marked the beginning of a flourishing career in retail for both of us. "He's 82 years old and he never goes out," I replied, "especially since this COVID business started. He's classed as a vulnerable person and doesn't want to take any chances. He won't even take a delivery without having it disinfected first." "He's not the only one," said Thomas. "I mean, look at this place." I cast my eyes around the room. This was the buying department of one of the largest food retailers in Britain. Roughly the size of a tennis court, the room accommodated around 30 people on a busy day, the office buzzing with activity as they went about their business. Today it seemed vast and empty, with Thomas and me being the only two occupants in the brightly lit space. Desks were empty, chairs unoccupied, and it was eerily quiet. It wasn't unusual for the office to be quiet at this time of year. We were in that strange week between Christmas and New Year when most businesses only keep a handful of staff on duty. But this year the situation was exacerbated by the pandemic's impact. Since the advent of the coronavirus earlier in the year, most of the office staff had taken to spending the majority of their time working from home. This was in stark contrast to those hardy souls, paid far less than us, who had been keeping the stores running during the crisis. There had been no isolating or furlough for them. Instead, they had been run off their feet keeping the stores stocked, not helped by panicked shoppers fighting over everything from jars of beetroot to toilet rolls. "Well, I think something's happened to him," I ventured, just sensing deep down that things weren't right. There was a gnawing sense of unease right in the pit of my stomach, as if a starving rodent had found its way inside and was munching its way through my innards. I could only remember feeling like this once before, and that was on the night my mother had died, almost 40 years ago. The same sensation had gripped me the moment her plane had plummeted into the depths of the Atlantic, even though I couldn't possibly have known it was happening. Many brush off such experiences as superstition, but I know what I felt. Over the years, I'd read enough accounts echoing my own to suggest that there was a kind of sixth sense at work in some people, and that was why I was so worried now. "You know, I have an inkling you may be right," said Thomas gently. "I think you should go and check on him." "Now?" I questioned. Far from reassuring me, his agreement merely added to my growing sense of unease. Experience had taught me that when Thomas said he had an inkling, it was well worth paying attention. "Why not? There's only the two of us here, so who's to care? It's not like there's much happening today. I'm thinking of knocking off early myself. It is New Year's Eve after all. I want to get back to Sarah and Stacey." It made sense, and given his uncanny ability to predict things with unerring accuracy, I knew I had to go. If Thomas thought there was something to worry about, then that was reason enough to act. It was nearly midday, so I decided to take an early lunch, drive over to the village and check on my father. I took my leave of Thomas, grabbed my jacket and headed out of the room, making for the stairs that led down to the staff entrance at the rear of the building. Unlike the grandiose reception reserved for visitors, this area was Spartan. We called it the tradesman's entrance, but it had more of a military feel about it, largely due to the presence of the fierce security guard, former army officer Barry. After a few years working in London, Barry had recently returned to his old job here in Oxford, and it hadn't taken him long to reacquaint himself with his surroundings. He knew the staff roster inside out and took great pleasure in pointing out the shortcomings of each employee at every opportunity. He was the antithesis of politically correct, which some days was amusing, but I wasn't in the mood for his banter today. I hoped he might be in his back office gorging himself on tea and biscuits, as was often the case. Then I would be able to slip by unnoticed. But no such luck. "Hold it right there, Taylor," he barked in a voice that never failed to make people obey. He hadn't been a sergeant major for nothing. "Where's your mask?" "Oh, sorry," I said, remembering what a stickler Barry was for the COVID rules. There was only me and Thomas in the office, and we were sitting 30 feet away from each other, so we thought it was okay to take them off. "Did you now? Scott's idea, was it? What have I told you about him, eh? You can tell a lot about a man by the state of his car. Do you know that? Well, you should go and have a look at his. Filthy it is, inside and out." "Yes, well, I'm sorry, Barry. I'll put it back on when I come back," I conceded, heading for the double doors and hitting the release button. But it didn't work. "Not so fast, young man." "Young man? Well, that's very kind of you, but I am 50, you know." "You're younger than me, so you're a young man. And that means I'm your elder, doesn't it? And how do we treat our elders?" I sighed and answered, "With respect," through gritted teeth. I did not disagree with the concept of automatically treating elders with respect just because they were older. It was one of the founding principles on which polite society was based, but it was difficult to justify sometimes. His words brought back memories of some of my old aunts and uncles, obnoxious individuals who demanded respect they didn't deserve. Then there were the sadistic teachers at the school I had been sent to at the age of 11. They gloried in the power they had over the boys and in certain cases abused it. Perhaps that was one of the reasons I resented authority so much. And right now, when I urgently needed to get out of the building, I had no time for Barry's silly games. "Right, lad, with respect. So, show me some respect. Put your mask on, and then I'll let you out. It's the rules." "But I'm going outside." "Yes, but you're not out there yet, are you?" "I would have been if you had let me. So what are you suggesting here? I put my mask on, walk 2 steps to the door, go outside, and then take it off again?" "Precisely," replied Barry. "If I let you off, then I'll be setting a precedent, won't I? Give people an inch and they'll take a mile. I should know. I used to work for a national radio station in London, and the big-name presenters were always trying to flout the rules just because they were famous. So when I came back here, I decided from day one that I would be operating a zero-tolerance policy. I'm not having any of that nonsense here." "Fine," I said, rolling my eyes as I pulled a disposable blue surgical mask from my pocket and began to loop it over my ears. I did not have the energy for an argument or to listen to one of Barry's long-winded anecdotes about his previous employment or his time in the military. I had a pressing need to go and find out what had happened to my father, so I would just have to play along until he relented and let me out. "Where are you going anyway?" asked Barry. "You can't be going out for lunch. I'm sure you must know that all the pubs are shut. We're in Tier 3. "Whatever that means," I replied. "I don't know how you keep up with all these rules. They seem to change nearly every day. If you must know, I'm going to check on a family member, that's all."
"Whilst following social distancing guidelines, I trust."
Of course, I replied, trying to sound sincere whilst wishing the man would just shut up. Can I go now, please? Hand sanitizer? Inquired Barry, gesturing at the recently installed dispensers on the wall. I complied, and finally he let me out. As soon as I was through the door, I turned around and made a big show of taking the mask back off. Then I made my way to the near-deserted car park. Less than a year ago, it was a struggle to find a space in the mornings, but not anymore. It was cold and clear, and I could feel the chill on my face within a few paces. The weak December sun was doing its best to warm my skin, but being so low in the sky, it was woefully ineffective. I hated British winters and wished I could fly off somewhere warm, but that wasn't allowed anymore either because of the restrictions. I got into the company Volvo, a recently acquired hybrid, and made my way out of the building, noting to my relief that the exit barrier was already up. That spared me having to buzz Barry and endure any further lengthy negotiations. Moments later, I was turning out onto the ring road. At least with everyone working from home, there was almost no traffic on the roads. It was scant consolation for the loneliness of the past 9 months. It was a close contender for the worst year of my life. I lived on my own with 2 marriages behind me, neither of which had produced any children. I had always wanted kids, but it was beginning to look unlikely, particularly since I had no girlfriend and little prospect of ever getting one under the current circumstances. I had spent most evenings during the lockdowns stuck at home on my own. There was only 1 year that had been worse than 2020, and that had been 1981, a time in my life I could barely bring myself to think about. I had spent a lifetime trying to blot the bad memories out, but today that was going to be impossible. I was going back to my childhood home, the place where much of the bad stuff had happened. I didn't visit that often because it had been made clear by my stepmother that I wasn't welcome. My father lived in Wisteria Cottage, the last of a row of 5 dwellings on the outskirts of a large village a few miles outside Oxford. Most of the other cottages were occupied by wealthy London commuters who had bought them up, modernised them, and now used them as weekend homes. I didn't know who any of these people were, and neither did my father, who said they kept themselves to themselves. He only knew they were from London courtesy of the snooping of Brenda, a nosy neighbour who had relayed this information to him. Hers was the only other cottage still owned by one of the locals, and she had lived there my entire life. Beyond my father's cottage lay the Meadowbrook Retirement Home. This was an exclusive and upmarket place for well-heeled senior citizens behind wrought iron black gates and high fences. During my childhood, it had all been very different. When I was growing up, it was Meadowbrook Farm, the home of my maternal grandparents and the Cartwright family seat for at least 200 years. My mother, Mary, was the youngest of the 4 Cartwright children. She had grown up there before she married my father, and they moved into the end cottage. 3 of the cottages were occupied by members of the family back then. They were the final generation from an era when most people didn't move far from their place of birth. Families lived in close-knit communities, the bonds of which had formed over many decades or even centuries. But in 40 short years, that way of life had disappeared. Sometimes I looked back on those childhood times with nostalgia, at least before the point where it began to unravel. But even before my mother died, it wasn't all good. While living in the bosom of one's family had its advantages, it could be stifling too when everybody knew everybody else's business and everyone was expected to know their place in the hierarchy, which, in my case, was right at the bottom. I have heard it said that the past is another country, and it certainly feels like that when I think back to that long-gone world. Society had changed more in my short time on Earth than at any other time in recorded history. Why did it all change? Transport, communication, and technology had all played a part in reshaping the wider world, but with our family there was more to it than that. The events of that painful year, just under 40 years ago, devastated our sleepy little lane, and the fallout drove our community apart. Things were never the same again, and I'm sorry to say that my father, the man I was on my way to see, was one of the key architects of that demise. Did I hate him for what he had done? It was a real body blow at the time, and there was nothing I could do about it. With my mother dead, I was left with only one parent, and who else was going to look after me? I could have moved in with my grandparents in the farmhouse, but they were elderly by then, and it would have been too much for them. All I could do was stay put, unlike my sister Linda, who disowned him. She was 19 and away at university by then, so she was able to take that stance. Before long, she met some rich tosser and washed her hands of both of us. I haven't spoken to her for years, and the last I heard of her was that she was living in Dubai. Meadowbrook Lane, as the name suggested, ran alongside the brook that gave it its name. It wasn't a very active brook most of the time, just trickling down the left side of the long gravel drive as you looked down the lane from the farmhouse. The lane was about 200 yards long from there to the junction with the main road at the other end. The only time the brook got lively was after periods of heavy rain. I remember it flooding a couple of times, the water coming over the drive and threatening the cottages, all of which were on the opposite side of the drive, but it always stopped short of flooding us out. The lane, which gently curved to the left, looked much as it always had, but the surrounding land was very different. The fields and woods that had been so full of adventure in my formative years were mostly gone now, replaced by ugly new housing estates. Back then I knew everyone who lived in each cottage. Now, other than Brenda, I hadn't a clue. As I turned into the lane and drove past the first three, I could see that they had all been extensively refurbished and extended in recent years. I noted at least £250,000 worth of cars parked outside, all with 20 or 70 number plates, which meant they were less than a year old. It was exactly what you would expect to find outside second homes for wealthy commuters. At least they hadn't changed the traditional names of the cottages. I knew them by heart, and as I drove slowly past, tyres crunching on the gravel, the ghosts of the past floated through my mind. First up was Rosemary Cottage, home of the dreaded Aunt Edith, who was unbelievably mean with money. We never called it Rosemary Cottage, though. It was only ever referred to as just Rosemary. That naming convention went for all the cottages. Next to Rosemary was Fuchsia, Uncle William's former home, where he had lived with his wife, Auntie Jackie, and their daughter, Tracy. I liked William and Jackie, but the thought of Tracy made me incandescent. What went on in that devastating summer of 1981 would have rivaled the storyline of any soap opera, and she was cast in a starring role. It's hard to know where to start when describing her. Back then she was just my cousin, but now she is also my stepmother. If that sounds incestuous, it's not, because she and my father aren't blood relatives, but given the scandal they caused at the time, they might as well have been. The middle cottage was Honeysuckle, the former home of the grumpiest pair of old gits I have encountered in my entire life. Edna and Stan hated kids, which wasn't good news for them when a gang of tearaway 10-year-olds were making mischief in the neighbourhood. I swear Stan, or Old Gitface as he was known, would have killed us if he had got his hands on us. His face used to go a furious purple shade when he was coming after us. Perhaps it was no surprise that it was a heart attack that got him in the end. Goodness knows what the old bugger's blood pressure must have been like. Next came Sunflower, home of the Foster family and our next-door neighbours. They were not relatives, but acted as if they were. Unlike the first 3 cottages, which had been done up in recent years, this one was falling into disrepair, particularly around the roof area where birds or rodents had ripped holes in the eaves. This cottage was one of the few surviving links to my childhood world, as it was the home of the aging Brenda, long a widow who lived there on her own. She was a lone constant in a world of change, but not a welcome one. As I drove past, I saw that, true to form, she was in her usual spot. Whether it was 1975, 1995, or 2020, there was one thing you could guarantee whenever you passed Sunflower. The blinds on the windows would be twitching as Brenda, the nosiest Parker in the history of the world, would have the end of her lengthy nose poking between 2 of the slats. This was her favourite vantage point for keeping her beady eyes on proceedings in the lane, which, because of its curving nature, enabled her to see the front of all the other cottages. When she wasn't watching from the window, she was out in the lane gossiping, most of which was utter horseshit. Her daughter, who thankfully no longer lived there, had inherited this trait, and when I was growing up, they would often hover like witches in the lane, ready to pounce on the unwary. It was fortunate for them that they had been born in an enlightened period, because in medieval times they would have been prime candidates for burning at the stake. I parked up outside the house where I had grown up with my mother, father, and sister. Now only he remained, and it was barely his house anymore. Tracy had well and truly taken over, particularly in recent years as old age had begun to take its toll on him. He was almost a quarter of a century her senior. I hadn't been here for a while, as Tracy didn't want me there and barely tolerated my weekly phone calls. But someone had to look out for him, because I wouldn't have put it past her to neglect him. I had a strong suspicion that she did not care about him anymore, and perhaps hadn't for a long time. His battered old Vauxhall Cavalier was in its usual place on the drive, looking rather forlorn, covered in bird shit and fallen leaves. It looked as if it hadn't moved for a while. Was he even still driving? I pulled in beside it, then went to knock on the front door. In past years, I used to let myself in, but that was before Tracy changed the locks, another hint that my presence was surplus to requirements. There was no answer, increasing my sense that something was wrong, so I tried the door, but it was locked. Then I heard the dreaded high-pitched voice of Brenda behind me. "You won't find him in there," she said, having taken her nose out from behind the blinds and come out to investigate what was happening. "And you shouldn't be here. It's the rules." I turned to see her standing about 10 yards away, warily keeping her distance with her face mask in place. At least this meant I'd be spared the sight of her crooked nose, which last time I had seen it was beginning to resemble a ski jump. I wouldn't normally mock someone's physical characteristics, either openly or in my private thoughts, but in the case of Brenda, she had such a vile personality that I had no qualms about it. Technically, if I understood the current regulations correctly, she was right that I ought not to be here. Knowing Brenda as I did, I wouldn't have put it past her to report me to the police. "That's okay," I said, thinking on my feet. "I'm in his bubble." "Well, I don't know why you've come here, spreading your germs. I thought you would have known. He's at the hospital." "No, I didn't know," I replied, annoyed not only at the suggestion that I was some sort of plague carrier, but also because it was clear that Tracy deliberately hadn't told me. "In a bad way, he was. Took him away in an ambulance, they did. I said to my Karen on the telephone, that'll be the COVID, that will. Rife it is. Ambulances going up and down to the care home all the time. Dropping like flies, they are. And I heard that old Mrs. Gittings from the flower shop is in a bad way. Such a shame. She only had that new hip last year. And, bloody hell, the woman just went on and on and on. It seemed like she had been doing it my whole life, and there was no escape from it. If if I didn't interrupt her, I'd be here until midnight, and I had no desire to see the new year in with her. "Thank you, Brenda," I said firmly. "Do you know where they took him?" "The John Radcliffe, I think. I overheard the ambulance men talking as they were loading him in." "Of course you did. Best I get myself up there then." I returned to my car and drove back down the lane, noting that Brenda had gone back inside, but I could still see the end of her nose poking out between the blinds as I passed. Then I drove to Oxford and up to the hospital where I had been born. For once, I had the rare luxury of finding a parking space right away. They were like gold dust at that hospital. It was only after I got out of the car that I wondered how I was going to find him. The John Radcliffe was a vast, sprawling complex built on the side of a hill with so many levels it was difficult to know where to start. I tried phoning Tracy on her mobile, but unsurprisingly, there was no response. She never answered calls from me, and I suspected she had long ago blocked my number. Never mind, I would just have to go to the main reception and ask. It was only when I got to the main entrance that I realized how difficult this was going to be. There were emergency regulations highlighted in large posters on the entrance, which made it clear in no uncertain terms that unless it was essential to be on the premises, visitors were not welcome. That explained the ease of finding a car parking space. Donning a mask to gain entry, I made my way to the reception desk to inquire about my father, but got little joy. I managed to establish that he was in the hospital, but I was firmly informed that I would be permitted to go no further. Then, as I was pondering my options, I realized I wouldn't have to. Turning away from reception empty-handed, I spotted Tracy descending the staircase in front of me, keeping strictly to the right-hand side, following the markings on the floor. My 57-year-old cousin and stepmother was wearing an expensive cashmere coat, and even at this distance I could see she was heavily made up. Her dark hair was neatly coiffed, and I could see that her nails were impeccably manicured, their bright red shade matching her coat. It was surprisingly out of character for her to look so glamorous, as her appearance was normally rather drab. It was as if she had just been on one of those makeover television shows. Who went to that much effort just for a trip to the hospital? It wasn't just her attire that was different to normal, it was her whole demeanour. She was practically bouncing down the stairs with a spring in her step, and if I could see behind her mask, I expect I would find her beaming away. I could see it in her eyes. Initially, I felt this was promising. If she was this happy, then it probably meant my dad was okay. Her good mood evaporated the instant she clapped eyes on me. I had got used to detecting people's emotions behind their face masks, and could imagine the scowl even if I couldn't see it. "What are you doing here?" she spat out venomously as I walked across the floor towards her. "I came to see Dad," I replied before a muscular bearded security guard interrupted. "Oi, social distancing," he bellowed. "Outside, now." "We'll talk outside," I said, as the guard ushered us at a safe distance of 2 meters out of the doors. "Sorry, but it's the rules," he said, shutting the door firmly behind us. It was the 3rd time today somebody had used that expression on me, and I was getting a tad fed up with hearing it. "Like I said, I came to find Dad," I said, whipping off my mask now we were out in the fresh air. "If it hadn't been for Brenda, I wouldn't have even known he was in here. You should have called me." "Trust that nosy old cow to spill the beans. But there was no point you coming here because you wouldn't have been allowed in any case," she said, keeping her mask on even though we were now outside. It gave the distinct impression she had something to hide. "They're only allowing 1 visitor per patient, and only then under exceptional circumstances." "Such as what?" I asked. "Like to say goodbye." A feeling of dread came over me as I realized what she meant. "You mean I said, my voice tailing off, unable to bring myself to say the words. Yes, he's gone. Was it COVID? I replied, noting that she hadn't said sorry or shown any sort of sympathy whatsoever. No, he had a heart attack 2 nights ago. I called an ambulance and they managed to keep him alive, but the damage was too much for him at his age. He slipped away about an hour ago. And you couldn't be bothered to tell me? I almost shouted, a mixture of grief at his death and anger at her attitude, leading to my raised voice as the emotions threatened to overwhelm me. Like I said, you wouldn't have been allowed in anyway, so why bother? She said aloofly, pulling back her sleeve and looking at what to me looked suspiciously like a Rolex. Caught in a whirlwind of emotions as I was, it didn't stop me from wondering about this and her luxurious coat. Where was all her money coming from? Then I thought about her descending the stairs full of the joys of spring. You don't seem particularly cut up about it, I stated, fighting to hold back the tears as I tried not to be overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation. The last thing I wanted to do was show weakness in front of her. He had his time, she said callously, but life goes on. So what happens now? I asked, thinking about everything that would need to be done. I mean, there's the funeral and the house. Oh, you don't need to worry about any of that, she said. It's all taken care of. Yes, but, I said, fearing the worst. Knowing what a money-grabbing bitch Tracy was, I felt I had to find out where I stood. I asked, what about the will? Oh, that's something else you don't need to bother yourself about. He changed it a while back, with my help, of course. If you were thinking of getting your hands on the family fortune, what little of it there is left, forget it. He's left the lot to me, Kevin, and Andrew. She was talking about my half-brothers, the 2 additional children my dad had fathered with her. They hadn't had anything to do with me for years. Tracy had successfully poisoned their minds against me while they were growing up. You can't do that, I said, aghast at the unfairness of it all. I had never been lucky with money, as a series of bad investments and my 2 divorces had left me with very little to show for my 50 years, despite having a good job. While the thorny question of inheritance had never concerned me that much, it seemed harsh that I would not be getting a penny from the home that had initially belonged to my mother and had been part of the family dynasty for generations, even if Tracy was herself a descendant of that family. I think you'll find it's all legal and above board, she said. So after the funeral, there's no need for you and me to have any further contact with each other. The whole time we had been talking, she had been casting her eye over my shoulder at the road beyond, and now I discovered why. On the road behind us, on the double red lines on which no stopping was permitted at any time, a silver 2-seater Lotus had pulled up and the driver was honking eagerly on the horn. I had the oddest feeling I had seen the car before, but I couldn't recall where. Oh, here's my lift, mustache, she said, her eyes lighting up with excitement. She walked over to the car, got in and made a big show of leaning over to the driver and snogging the face off him, which was clearly for my benefit. No wonder she wasn't bothered about my dad's death or about how I felt. She was all sorted already, and it was then that I remembered where I had seen the car before. It had been parked outside Honeysuckle when I had driven up Meadowbrook Lane earlier. So she had done it again. As a precocious teenager, she had seduced my father, and now she had got her claws into some rich twat of a neighbour who was quite happy to stop on the red lines. I watched as an ambulance which had just raced in, lights blazing, found him blocking its access. No doubt it was he who had lavished the coat and the Rolex on her. I was surprised Brenda hadn't said anything about it. If they had managed to sneak around the lane and hide their affair from her, they must have been extraordinarily careful. But with my father gone now, They would have no further need for discretion. I watched the car roar off as the driver, who I hadn't got a proper look at, went through the gears as if he was on the starting grid at Brands Hatch. Then he almost knocked over a pensioner as he sped over a zebra crossing. The man was without doubt a bellend of the first order. I stood for a moment, allowing the grief to flow over me now that she was out of sight. It wasn't just his death I was upset about, but all the wasted years that had preceded it. I felt the tears welling up, but before they could drip down my face, I heard a strangely familiar voice behind me. "Sounds like you've had a bit of bad luck there, my old son," said the man in a strong Cockney accent. I turned and recognized him straight away. By that I mean I knew his face and his voice because I had seen him on TV. However, his name temporarily escaped me. He went by some sort of nickname, and I scrabbled around in my head trying to retrieve it. How long had he been standing there, and how much of the previous conversation had he overheard? "Oh, hello," I said, stumbling a bit. Given my dad's death and the unpleasant encounter with Tracy, it was no surprise I was not quite with it. "You're that bloke off the telly, aren't you? The golden geezer or something?" "The diamond geezer," he corrected me in an annoyed tone, "but you can call me Keith." "Of course, Keith Diamond," I said, now my memory had been jogged. "What brings you here? Is it a story about the hospital? I'm afraid I'm not feeling up to being interviewed, if that's what you want. My father has just died." "I'm sorry to hear that, said Keith, leaving the sentence hanging as he allowed me to introduce myself. "Nick," I replied. "NickTaylor." "Well, NickTaylor, to quote the late great Eamon Andrews, this is your life." Sorry, I've been dying to say that. Perhaps I should have brought a big red book with me. He wasn't making much sense, but whatever he was here for, it didn't seem to have anything to do with the television. There was no film crew or anyone else around. He was on his own. "I don't understand," I replied weakly. "What are you talking about?" "Let me put it another way. Perhaps I should have said, this is a bit of your life. Specifically, how would you like to spend a year in 1981? I would bloody hate it. It was the worst year of my life. I was sent to a school that I despised, my mother died in a plane crash, and my father had an affair with my cousin. She was the woman that just left, in case you were wondering. "Keep it in the family, eh?" said Keith. "I don't know, you country folk." "They weren't blood relatives," I added, knowing what he was implying. It was a conclusion the few people I had confided in about it always jumped to. "Sounds like it was a bit of an annus horribilis, as Her Majesty, God bless her, once said," replied Keith. "But suppose those events weren't necessarily set in stone. What if I told you that you could go back and maybe, if it's meant to be, make things turn out differently?" "I'd say you've got a very vivid imagination, or you're mentally ill." "I'm sure you would. I said as much to the woman who sent me back in time. Look, rather than stand around talking for hours, perhaps we should cut to the chase. Hold out your arm." He reached out his left arm towards me as if wanting to shake hands, but with the wrong hand. "What about social distancing?" I asked. "Fuck social distancing," he said. "Just do it." I felt curiously compelled to comply, and then the strangest thing happened. As soon as our hands touched, a golden bracelet with a bright green jewel in the center materialized on his wrist and then, in lightning fast time, detached itself and wrapped itself around my own. The whole process took a couple of seconds at most. "There," said Keith. "Better?" "Not really," I said, wondering what this thing was. There was something odd about it, electronic perhaps. I could sense it throbbing with power, but not just in my arm. It was almost as if it were reaching into my mind. What the hell just happened? Yeah, that's kind of how I reacted when it happened to me, said Keith. The truth of the matter is that you are now custodian of the timeline. That sounds rather important, I said. It is, said Keith. With that bracelet comes great responsibility. At midnight tonight, you're going back to spend a year in 1981. Under any other circumstances, I would have decried this statement as bullshit, but somehow the bracelet's presence made me believe him. I looked at the green jewel pulsing and somehow knew that it was sentient. This thing was alive and it was merging with me. Why? I asked. I mean, why me? No one knows. I don't know why I was chosen when I spent the year in 1980, but believe me, it's an amazing experience. It's changed my whole life. You changed history? I asked. I thought that was frowned upon. It is in all the time travel films. Only if the bracelet approves of it. Sometimes you can change things, sometimes you can't. You'll figure it out, and other times you'll be preventing things from happening. I stopped a nuclear bomb going off in London, would you believe? But where am I going to be? How am I going to live? And won't people wonder what this futuristic device is on my wrist? Ah, yes, I should have clarified that. You'll be back in your body as you were in 1981. That's one of the bonuses. I was only 22 back then, and I made the most of it, if you catch my drift. Oh, and don't worry about the bracelet. It's invisible to everyone but you. Yes, but in 1981, I was only 10, I exclaimed. How am I going to be able to stop nuclear bombs and stuff at that age? I only got £1 a week pocket money, and I had to be in bed by 8 p.m. I'm not going to have the freedom to do the things you could, am I? Good point. Where are you living in 1981? In a village not far from here. I'm guessing nuclear bombs weren't on the agenda then, but the bracelet always selects people for a reason. It chose me, and it chose you. It will find things for you to do. How did it find me? It guided me here to find you. You'll be doing the same after you get back when you pass it on to the next person. But don't worry about that now. Just concentrate on 1981. The best thing you can do right now is go home and cram every bit of information you can lay your hands on about that year into your mind. That's what I should have done before I went back, but instead, I spent all day in the pub.